Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you all joining the call today, especially on a beautiful day. Today's the fourth webinar in our 5-strand series. And I have just a few reminders before we get started. All upcoming professional development offerings are listed on our webpage, nysrti.org. So please check that out. A copy of today's PowerPoint as well as some handouts are available on our webpage under webinars and then today's webinar title. Also during the presentation, please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll post a link to a brief evaluation. If you could please take a few minutes to complete that, we do look at that feedback and appreciate you taking the time to do that. We're very pleased to have back with us Dr. Seth Aldridge to present the Strand 15 series integrating tiered database decision-making to address essential questions in an RTI process. Today's topic is individual problem-solving meetings. And again, it's the fourth webinar in our 5-session strand. Dr. Aldridge is a certified bilingual school psychologist as well as a New York State licensed psychologist who earned his PhD in psychology at Syracuse University. He works as a school psychologist for the Homer Central School District and also consults with school districts across the U.S. concerning response to intervention for academic and behavioral difficulties. Seth consults with districts to utilize FastBridge learning as well as AIMSweb and other RTI assessments as part of a database decision-making within a tiered problem-solving process. He is a consortium member with the New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center and works primarily with English as a new language learners, as well as family court-involved youth in his private practice. And it's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Seth Aldridge.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back for those of you who have participated in the other webinars. And welcome to those of you who might be new to this. Obviously today we're going to be talking about individual problem solving and how that piece fits into the tiered database decision making. I would just want to kind of go over the main topics for today, talking about when we do sit down and address individual students. Typically, many schools have these meetings. They might last anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, and we're focused on the issues to address problem solving for an individual student. We're going to talk about who you might want to have in the room when you're talking about that, the referral process so that we can kind of hit the ground running when we begin that meeting, steps to individual problem solving, characteristics, ways that you might, both the process and content of that meeting that are going to lead to successful outcomes for students, how you would support intervention follow-through, data to monitor outcomes for students, and using tools. We really are trying to focus on developing an infrastructure so that the data and the tools that we're using fit multi-purposes, and that's how we can work smart and efficiently. It's all about planning, coordinating, communicating data, and then responding to the data in a way that benefits students and educators. Molly, if you could just kind of put up some of the polls, and we really do appreciate when you do participate in these polls. It helps us to know who's here, and I can kind of address some of the issues to the demographics of the folks involved. I see that we've got some literacy interventionists, special educator, administrators, principal or assistant principal, school psychologist, classroom teachers. So we have a nice broad range of folks participating. And again, keep kind of weighing in here. It's really helpful when you participate in these polls. And we see a real nice span of grade levels. So I see that we've got mostly K through 8, but a lot of people that work in multiple. And then, we've got one person in 9 through 12. I do think that these kind of individual problem-solving teams, the data might look a little bit differently for the secondary folks, but really sitting down as somebody who works with kids involved in probation and juvenile justice, having a meeting to really talk about the needs of these students I think can go a real long way. So that's nice to have folks in secondary involved. Thanks, Molly. We'll move on. This should look familiar to those of you who have participated in the webinars, in the past week's webinars. And again, it's a review slide, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But suffice it to say, we want to address, certainly at an individual problem-solving meeting, we really want to address all the prioritized problems. They might be social, emotional, and behavioral. They might be academic. Sometimes we've got a problem that appears to be academic, but some of the source of the problem might be social, emotional, and behavioral, and so they kind of have to do with one another. Or we have a student who's acting out. And then when we kind of pair it away, we see that there's some academic deficits, or the behavior is escape motivated because the tasks in the classroom are too difficult. And so it's really important to really look at both, especially when we're really trying to figure out at an individual student level what's contributing to the problem, what's maintaining the problem, and how can we best target interventions to meet students' needs. For tiered problem solving, again, this is a review slide. We've talked about this in the previous webinar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But we're really, at this point, I do want to kind of refer back to this because we've done triage at the post-benchmark data meeting, and we've kind of looked at all the students across the grade level. We might be monitoring some progress of students, but at these post-benchmark meetings and progress monitoring checkup meetings, we really begin to prioritize who are those students that we want to spend maybe 30, I tend to find that 30 to 40 minutes is really necessary to go through all the steps of individualized problem solving. Sometimes when we cut that time short, we might really not follow all the necessary steps to arriving at a targeted intervention for the student and really understand some of those complex problems that we're going to be talking about today. You know, a lot of times students that warrant and are prioritized these meetings might be those who either academically or behaviorally are, you know, kind of on the really on the radar screen for needing intensive supports or maybe even Tier 2. It doesn't mean that students in Tier 1 wouldn't have some concerns that we would want to prioritize for these meetings. We're going to focus mainly on non-special education decisions. Next week we're going to be talking about some of the students that might need multidisciplinary team meetings. That would be more the special ed decision making. I try to put that in the topic category of kind of school or district kinds of concerns that we would want to talk about. So that'll be on next week's webinar where we really talk about some of the special ed decision making, because some of the criteria and the way we use data for that should be decided at a district or school level. So I'm going to put that into that webinar category. But we're really going to be talking about these individual problem-solving team meetings. But as you can see, a lot of our infrastructure that we have, whether it's the assessments that we conduct, the database decision-making process at these grade level meetings, they really help to prepare us for how we're going to address the individual problem solving. I have to say that there are some things that just have not gone away in my almost 30 years of being a school psychologist. The stages of problem solving are one of those things that have been kind of in play. And I have to say, you know, whether it's the way I look at school problems, the way I look at trying to solve problems within my, you know, personal or family life, we first start with trying to identify the problem. If we don't know what the problem is, we can't solve it. And really having a clear problem identification and clear prioritization of what the problem is essential to solving problems. Once we identify what the main problems are, what it looks like, what it sounds like, really operationalizing that into kind of very specific terms, we want to know what's kind of underlying that problem. What are some of the root causes? If we kind of have a understanding for what that problem is and what created the problem in the first place, what contributes to the problem. A clear problem analysis really helps us, again, to identify some interventions for that. Many times I kind of skip over to the intervention planning stage because I want to know, okay, well, what are some things that we can do for the problem? And that helps me to set goals for, well, what would it look like if the problem is getting better? And so we evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. And it's not really a lockstep process. We tend to kind of go back and forth in the stages of problem solving, but we want to make sure that all of these things are in place. Now, if you've got a good infrastructure for RTI, the evaluation of effectiveness could very well be some of those data tools that you're using for progress monitoring, for the diagnostic assessments that we've looked at, and we're going to look at that a bit closer today. The interventions that you're planning should be, you're going to know that those are available because you've created that infrastructure on that intervention menu that I've shown you during previous webinars and will show you again today. I find that the intervention menu and knowing what's available for students in the school at a given grade level for various difficulties is essential when we're planning those interventions. If you think that the intervention is present in the school and then you go after a 40-minute meeting and find out that it's not there, you've just wasted a lot of time. So having the infrastructure for RTIs can really help with this process for problem solving. George Batch would say, problem solving is a process that uses the skills of professionals from different disciplines to develop and evaluate intervention plans that improve significantly the school performance of individual and or groups of students. This is the problem solving process. And I think one of the things that is really important here is professionals from different disciplines. We all see problems from a different perspective. We all, as educators, kind of have hopefully some convergent views, but we kind of see things from a different way. And by kind of having a meeting of the minds from classroom teachers, support staff, whether it's speech language, whether it's special educators, behavior interventionists, psychologists, administrators, all those people that kind of come together, we have a different perspective on things that's very helpful when we solve problems. I do want to mention parents can be a very helpful part of these problem-solving meetings. I think different schools have different perspectives on that, and we'll talk about membership in just a little bit. So in terms of our questions that we're trying to answer, and again, this should be a kind of a familiar slide, but what questions are we trying to address through data and through information that we're collecting? Many times, we want to know, what do the students know? What are they capable of doing? And that might be academic, whether it's letter sounds, whether it's language, whether it's oral reading fluency, being able to read words, whether it's math problems that they know and don't know. So what are their needs and what do we need to teach? It might also be social, emotional, and behavioral goals. Sometimes we need to teach students certain behaviors. And so what is it that they, perhaps behaviors or coping skills that they know but they're just not implementing, or maybe it's a coping skill that they need to be taught. These are really important things for us to identify. What are their needs and what do we need to teach? As well as that evaluation of progress in our problem-solving process. If our first steps of trying to address the problem aren't working, we need to have progress monitoring systems in place, whether it's academic or whether it's social, emotional, behavioral, to know whether we should stay the course because they're meeting their goals or on the road to meeting their goals, or if you need to make an adjustment. Last week we spent a lot of time on formative evaluation for academic and behavioral outcomes. If you're new to this webinar and you weren't present last week, that webinar is recorded and available to you to go over that progress monitoring piece. Again, if you have the infrastructure for RTI, a lot of these steps won't have to be reduplicated once you get to the individual problem-solving meeting. The RTI process, it creates that infrastructure to make this, to support that process. So in terms of our hierarchy, informal consultation with colleagues, our post-benchmark data meetings, I suggest and I really encourage schools to try to generate your individual problem-solving meetings from the post-benchmark data meeting or the checkup data meetings. When you're sitting down at a grade level, you really kind of get a sense of who are the students that you have the highest sense of urgency for to sit down and talk about. Many times we'll be at a post-benchmark data meeting and we begin to talk about a student for more than 1 or 2 minutes. That student's name gets written down and we say, is this a possible referral for our problem-solving team meeting, where we really sit down and talk about students individually. And it really, these post-benchmark meetings really help to prioritize that process. So across the grade levels, we would collect the names, kind of get a sense of urgency about those students, and then begin to have those individual meetings after the data meeting. So these effective problem-solving team meetings we use to identify and understand really more complex problems, meetings that are triage meetings at the post-benchmark and checkup meeting level aren't going to be able to address. And we really sit down and really try to understand individual students, plan and evaluate interventions. Again, typically these might be students who are kind of designated as requiring Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, but not necessarily. Clearly, we would also get referrals to individual problem-solving meetings, not necessarily from post-benchmark meetings. Teachers are always welcome to make those referrals if they're really stumped on a student and need to sit down with a team of folks, get our heads together and problem solve. And from these problem-solving meetings, many times we see that this is a student that's come back to the problem-solving meeting time and time again. We've been reviewing data. The student isn't making progress. We've really tried to look at diagnostic, and we'll talk about what we mean by diagnostic data, but we've really looked at data to try and understand the problem. They're not making progress. We've got a thorough understanding that it's not because they need glasses or they can't hear the teacher, or there are all these other variables that we'll talk about during this webinar. And so they've not responded to intervention, and we might then consider them for the multidisciplinary team meetings. Again, we might talk about this as a individual problem-solving meeting when we go to Committee on Special Education decision-making. That is sort of an individual problem-solving team. But I'm not going to talk, I'll talk about that a little bit in this webinar. It'll be a larger focus in next week's webinar. So this is kind of the level that we're talking about. It's all part of that infrastructure that we've been describing. And each piece supports the other. Again, we talked about this slide 2 webinars ago, but many schools only, in fact, I worked significantly in Syracuse City Schools. We had a school-based intervention team project in the 90s. And I was fortunate enough to be on that process. And at the time, we really didn't do a lot of grade level meetings. Every problem that we had an individual problem-solving meeting. And those meetings were effective in many respects, but we really, there was a backlog of cases, and it was quite frustrating. It's why I really appreciate grade level meetings where we do that triage, because in a school of 450 students, 20% of them needing meetings, that might be 90 students. If we're doing 2 traditional 30 to 40 minute meetings per week, and I'm going to be asking you all students, so please participate in this poll. I'd like to know how many of these meetings in your school you might meet on across the school. If you're only having 2 of these meetings or 3, in 40 weeks, you're only going to be meeting on 80 students. 10 of the students are met on in July, and that's without follow-up meetings. So the grade level meetings are hugely important for that, getting kids into the interventions right away, but then prioritizing individual problem-solving meetings for some students. So that is a huge part of the infrastructure, are the grade level meetings. So this is kind of having a form at the grade level meeting where students who might need an additional assessment, diagnostic assessment, because your benchmark and progress monitoring assessments, they can be very good for helping to understand problems, helping to know whether students are responding. But when students aren't responding, and the benchmark assessment, for example, an oral reading fluency or a math computation probe, or some of you all use STAR, and you're kind of get that computer adaptive assessment, but you really aren't getting specific information about what exactly is going on with the student that needs to be addressed. We might really need to prioritize some students for additional assessments. And we're going to talk about what some of those diagnostic assessments are in just a second. So we would list students, the student name, what assessments we're going to provide. Now we want to be kind of careful and prudent about who we're going to prioritize for those assessments, because these assessments take time out of instruction for the student and time from instructing on the part of staff that are administering those assessments. We also talk about who's going to need an additional meeting. Is it a parent meeting? Is it an individual problem-solving team meeting? Have we decided that it's time to go to a multidisciplinary team meeting or a CSE referral? And specify what kind of meeting do we need to have for that student, and who's going to be responsible for planning that meeting. So at the grade level meeting, we kind of get our ducks in a row for all these different diagnostic assessments and planning future meetings. Again, it's part of that infrastructure where we're very organized in our problem-solving approaches. So the infrastructure for RTI really helps us to, again, be organized in how we do things. The RTI benchmark assessment, sometimes from an oral reading fluency probe or a nonsense word probe or a math computation probe, or some of the computer adaptive tests give us some guidance into skills that the student might be working on still. But they may or may not be diagnostic enough to really truly identify problems. Many times we need additional diagnostic assessments. These really specify exactly what the needs are of the student. Is it a, and again, we're going to talk about specifically what some of these diagnostic assessments are. In terms of an infrastructure piece that I want to talk about, it's really helpful if even before your post-benchmark meeting, so you collect the benchmark assessments, say in late September. In between that September assessment for benchmark assessment and your post-benchmark grade level meeting, if you could say, wow, these 5 kids, we're really worried about them. I think we need to collect some more assessments. Once you get to the grade level meeting, you've got more than just the benchmark assessment to go from. Maybe then from the grade level meeting, you've got some further students that you need to collect some further information on and really understand what's going on. And again, we're going to get to the types of assessments in just a second. Then we also have progress monitoring assessments built into our RTI infrastructure to know, is it working? Are we on track? Or are things not working? And there's something about the student that we really just need to understand further. In terms of who should be present at an individual problem-solving team meeting, I don't think that there's any really hard and fast rules about this. But in terms of frequency, it's really as needed. I do believe, in all my experience, I think really if you're going to truly focus on the true problem-solving process, where we're really looking at the needs of the students, it's going to take 30 to 40 minutes, I've found, if we're really focused on identifying the problem, understanding it, coming up with some interventions that are really doable, really talking about the details of the intervention, how it will be supported, how we're going to evaluate the outcomes, and then planning some follow-up meetings. That's going to be a good 30 to 40 minutes, honestly. It helps if we've got progress monitoring tools established, if we've got some diagnostic assessments already there prior to the meeting where the problem has been truly specified by people involved with the student, that makes the process go much more efficiently. But I find it, again, it's going to take about 30 to 40 minutes. You definitely want the student's teacher there. We want the interventionist that might be working with the student. I think sometimes school psychologists are good folks to have there. If it's a language problem, having a speech-language pathologist there, having a social worker there, if there are some background issues that really need to be discussed, things that we have control over. School administrators, that's kind of an interesting one. I find school administrators are very helpful at meetings. When I worked with the school-based intervention team process, many teachers really wanted a chance to talk about these issues without the school administrator there. It's really up to the school. But certainly it's extremely important that if people aren't feeling judged or evaluated at these meetings. I find school administrators helpful at the meetings just because they can really help with things like scheduling and resource allocation and things like that. So they can be a very powerful presence at the meeting. Parents are another, I didn't put that down here, but sometimes parents can be very helpful members to the problem-solving process. I would say that that's really up to the classroom teacher. Sometimes teachers want to sit down and really talk about a student's difficulties very candidly, and may feel that, through just being kind of diplomatic about things, aren't able to really talk candidly about the problem. I think bringing parents into the problem-solving process at some point is extremely important, and having them informed that the meeting took place, what we talked about, how we're supporting their students. As a parent myself, I would be very appreciative of having that information, and I might feel a little put off if the school was so concerned about my student or about my child that they're having a 30-minute meeting and not letting me know about that. So sometimes when I put the parent hat on, I know that I would want the parent, if not a member of the meeting, to certainly be informed about that, and that is a step to the problem-solving process. So our responsibilities at this team meeting are to understand, identify and understand complex problems of individual students. So I'm really interested in getting information from you. For those of you who work in schools where there are these problem-solving meetings going on, I'm wondering how many students do you discuss per week? I find a great deal of variability in the schools that I work with. Some, it might be, I find generally 2 to 3. Then other schools I've worked with, they might talk about 10 students per week, but they're very, very short meetings. So I'm seeing, thank you very much for those of you who are participating with the poll. I'm seeing 0 to 1. One school, 4 to 6, 1, 2 to 3. So, okay. Anybody else want to weigh in? Thank you very much. Thanks, Molly. So before the problem-solving meeting, and I, sometimes if I think of, and so there's just a comment here, we meet monthly and discuss from 10 to 20 students. Okay, thank you. So before the meeting, and I guess I would say that if we've got, and not to put a price tag on things, but I think when we're really talking about limited resources and time in schools, and I think it is very important to discuss resources and time and how we use our time productively. If we're talking about a meeting that lasts for 30 to 40 minutes with perhaps 3, 4, 5 professionals sitting around a table talking about a student, that's kind of an expensive meeting. And I want that 30 to 40 minutes to be extremely productive. And at the end of the 40 minutes, I want a really positive result, something that's going to work out and support the teacher and support the student. So it's really important that we kind of hit the ground running when we start the meeting. So preparing, we want to prioritize. We want to make sure that we're meeting about the right students. It's not just, we're not meeting on students just for those students whose teachers don't mind completing the paperwork or really feel, yeah, I really like to sit down with my colleagues and talk about things, and others that just like to shut their door and teach. It really should be students who are prioritized based on needs. That's why I like putting all the students at a grade level on a level playing field, talking about them all, and really prioritizing them from the grade level data meeting. Having a referral form where we really try to get my pointer here. Having a referral form where we begin to specify the problem. I'm going to talk about problems and being very specific in how we identify problems. That can be extremely important. The referral form really helps us to hit the ground running. Any additional data, having that diagnostic data. What we don't want to do is sit down at the data meeting, identify a problem, and then kind of scratch our heads and say, well, I still don't really understand what's causing this, or we don't really have enough information to understand the problem or to prioritize or really understand or identify the problem. So now we've just sat down for 30 minutes with 5 people, and before we can come up with the intervention, we have to go and do another assessment. Having the assessment data before the meeting can be extremely helpful for a productive meeting. Making sure that the data is specific enough so that you know exactly what skills, academic skills, or social, emotional, behavioral priorities we need to address. Identify things that have worked in the past or things that haven't worked. Looking at progress monitoring data to see have there been things that have worked? Are things working now? Are things really not working? And really sharing, so when you get the referral form and any of the data that you've collected, you don't want that meeting where you're all sitting down perhaps at 8:30 in the morning, and that's the first time anybody has seen the data. So you're spending 5 or 10 minutes trying to process the data and understand it. The participants in the meeting should have seen the data before they even get to the meeting. And that's going to really help you hit the ground running when you begin the meeting. Having that menu of interventions that I've kind of presented before so that you know exactly what's available for the students. Very helpful in preparing for a problem-solving meeting. When you have your ducks in a row through a really good RTI process and infrastructure, it's going to make these meetings go much more productively and efficiently. I've kind of hit you over the head with this intervention menu, but again, I can't tell you how many times I've sat down at a 30 or 40-minute meeting and unfortunately talked about an intervention that doesn't exist in the school. We thought it was available, but perhaps we were mistaken. So having all the interventions available at a given grade level, what grade level it's used, what it addresses specifically, is it evidence-based or not, what supports we need to have in order to pull it off, time of day needed, days per week, group size, and how we're going to support that intervention. Having this can be key. We don't want to sit down and talk about an intervention that just isn't feasible, isn't available, or may really have never had any source of evidence that it ever worked in the first place. So this intervention menu is key to our process. It also, you don't have to kind of sit there when it gets to the intervention planning phase of the meeting, kind of be trying to remember what you have available in the building. It's right there in front of you. So the steps of problem solving, you identify and prioritize the problem. This might take about 10 minutes. So I'm talking about a 40-minute meeting here. It takes about 10 minutes to really go over the referral form very quickly. People should have already seen it before entering the meeting. Looking at the diagnostic data and reviewing the diagnostic data, that's really going to specify what we need to address with a problem. We're going to really talk about specific information that helps us to guide interventions. Consider causal change. If this were achieved, then this wouldn't happen. In terms of behavioral principles, if the student were on task and engaged, they wouldn't be bothering other kids. So sometimes we talk about causal change. If a student had a good instructional match and they were able to do the classwork, then they wouldn't be engaging in escape motivated behavior. If they knew their letter sounds or their short vowel sounds, they would be more proficient at decoding words and reading more proficiently. You want to be very specific about these problems that we're trying to identify. We don't want to be just saying, student has a reading problem. That tells me nothing about what we're going to be doing to intervene for that problem. So that problem identification stage is hugely important. We then analyze the problem. What contributes to it? If it's literacy, we consider the big 5 ideas: phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Hopefully there's some diagnostic data available to know, are there problems in these areas that might be contributing to things that we need to really focus our interventions on. For math, there might be specific skills. So doing sort of a skill inventory that maps onto what's being instructed in the classroom. What skills are deficient that if we taught would bring the student up and make them be able to access the curriculum much more effectively. As a person who does a lot of assessment, I know we sometimes neglect our secondary folks or middle school folks, but as somebody who works with a lot of 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th graders who are in the juvenile justice system, I know that many of them can't add and subtract with regrouping. It's very rare that some of these students can add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators. So getting a very specific idea about where those skill gaps are that we need to, where we need to provide direct instruction as an intervention can be key to addressing the problem. And then social emotional behavior. Is it not, certainly there might be skill deficits, but there are also social emotional behavioral. We know that academic engagement is key to addressing problems. Attention issues may be key to engagement. Motivation may be key to engagement. Is it attention or is it motivation? So really trying to get an understanding of that and having that information available before the meeting begins. What we don't want to do, this is key, we don't want to be trapped into admiring the problem and discussing factors that we have no control over. Setting a culture in your meetings where no one's being blamed, but the very things that we have control over in school are the focus of these meetings. Otherwise, the meeting's going to go nowhere. We have to talk about what we have control over. So after we identify and understand the problem, we begin planning some interventions. What interventions do we have available that maps onto these problems that we've identified and understood them in a way that helps us to plan the intervention? Again, knowing there's also, sometimes I'll find, well, we're going to put them in a 10th period intervention block, or we're going to, let's put them in AIS, or let's put them in resource. That's not necessarily an intervention. It's what happens during those times that are the intervention. Specifically, what intervention approach are you going to use that addresses that problem, not the place that you're going to send the student 10th period or even a next step. Having a parent meeting isn't an intervention. That might be an important step. Collecting some additional diagnostic data might be a next step. That's not an intervention. So knowing what an intervention is and what a next step is would be important. There are meeting notes that are available for download under this webinar that kind of talk about meeting notes where you kind of go through the problem identification, background information, and problem analysis, what your next steps, what your interventions are, and what your next steps are. Those forms are available for download, as well as the referral form that helps folks to identify the problem. We want to set realistic and ambitious goals. How will we know that the student is on target for the problem to be addressed? So if we've got good RTI assessments, and again, we went over formative evaluation for academics as well as social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes last week. There's some materials on that webinar. So that would be the third webinar that we did on progress monitoring or formative evaluation. There's some tools available for download there if you haven't already seen those. But if you've got that infrastructure for tools that are available and people that conduct those assessments, people that know how to conduct those assessments, a lot of that step during the individual problem-solving meeting have been addressed. So these steps might be very quick. Oh yeah, our general outcome measure for a student with a reading problem, the foundation reading problem, might be an oral reading fluency probe that's conducted once a week. Or to evaluate outcomes for a social, emotional, behavioral problem, the direct behavior ratings can be, that are targeted to the identified problem, can be a very, very, very helpful way to evaluate those outcomes. And number 7 is to plan the parent communication. Again, as a parent, I would definitely want to know if my child were brought up to one of these meetings, and I would really want to be part of that team. I might not feel that I have to be present when the staff are talking about my child candidly. It would be nice if I were brought in and we had a meeting after. I probably, as a parent, would insist on that. But at least that they're communicating what that plan is with me. It's very important that all information be documented because we want to be able to remember that information and I like to keep an electronic record. In fact, the materials that I have for download, the referral is an electronic document. So the teacher or referral person would input that information on an electronic document that can be shared much more easily. The same with the notes that we take. We collect everything electronically so that we can share it among staff currently, as well as we keep these records electronically and then share them with the next grade level. So we have an ongoing record of things that have been done for the student. So when we talk about effective problem identification, you really want to be very specific. Saying that a student has even a reading problem, that's not specific enough. We want to be able to say, Zach knows the short E and I sound, but not the a, or That tells me what I need to teach Zach. And if he's a first grader, this is a pretty significant problem. He's not going to access first grade reading if he doesn't know these vowel sounds. Of course, this is very kind of limited what I put here. You might have several other letter sounds that Zach doesn't know. But you can see that I'm being very specific about this. Hannah can read nonsense words sound by sound, but when she goes to blend them, says bat. Well, I might want to know a little bit, first of all, I'd probably want to know a little bit more about blending. But if there's a consistent pattern there, I know that the intervention might have to do with blending sounds. Lily reads 6th grade material accurately, 97% accuracy in her social studies book, but only reads 70 words per minute, very disfluent. So she's really going to be struggling with that social studies book. So doing we call this curriculum-based evaluation, where you might look at rate and accuracy out of the curriculum materials, whether it's reading or math. This can really help us to specifically identify what's going on with the student. In previous webinars, I showed slides of the experience of reading with 85% accuracy, 90% accuracy, and 95% accuracy. It's not until somebody reads with 95% accuracy that there's true comprehension. We misidentify problems much of the time as say a comprehension problem when it's really they just don't have the foundation skills to access the curriculum. So for math, Lily can add double-digit numbers but makes errors on problems requiring regrouping. This helps me to know what intervention we might want to provide for Lily. It's very specific. Zach has difficulty reading math assignments and therefore does not understand them when he works independently. This isn't a math problem, it's a reading problem. Hannah does not add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators. Again, what specific skills do we need to address through an intervention? I do want to put in this plug, and there's a very good video on interventioncentral.org. If you aren't aware of that site, it provides lots of free intervention for folks. If you just search for how to define academic problems for intervention planning, it's on the homepage of interventioncentral.org. There's a video where Jim Wright goes through really specifically identifying problems that can really lead to more effective interventions. You don't you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is. So we get to diagnosis. There are two very different definitions for diagnosis. One is really classifying a disease. So if we say the student has a learning disability, well, that's a diagnosis. Student has pneumonia. That's a diagnosis. If we say that there's a learning disability, that doesn't necessarily tell me anything about how to understand and address that problem. If I really look at diagnostic data to investigate or understand that problem, so we're really going to focus on this definition of diagnostic data, where we really try to really research the problem and understand what the student can and does not yet do, so that we can provide an intervention that addresses that specific problem. We're not just saying this student has a reading problem. We're saying specifically what is it about reading that we need to address for that student. That's the diagnostic information that we're talking about today, not necessarily just labeling the problem. So when we look at a hierarchy, and what were diagnostic assessments that are conducted in schools, teachers are constantly conducting kind of informal diagnostics. If they're looking at Lily computing a subtraction problem up on the whiteboard, that's a diagnostic assessment. She sees where, or just walking around the room and surveying the students' independent seat work. That's a diagnostic assessment, seeing where the process is strong or what they can do and where it's breaking down. These informal observations of skills are happening constantly with teachers. Sometimes, though, we want to be a little bit more structured in how we're observing. So, for example, I really like the idea of, say, taking a social studies or science or math textbook and have the student read from it for 1 minute and see whether they see what kind of accuracy in reading, error patterns. Are they reading with enough accuracy to comprehend that text? So some semi-structured assessments that we're doing for curriculum-based evaluation and being more formal about how we're kind of understanding problems can be extremely helpful. Then we've got information from universal screenings that we're using from RTI. Letter sounds, recoding errors on nonsense word fluency, strategies used when we're collecting RCBM. If there's a math computation probe, what kinds of skills, looking at the error patterns in that math computation probe, or writing samples. See, we have a CBM writing sample where we have a 3-minute sample, and you can see kind of qualitatively where their mechanics are breaking down, spelling, grammar, things like that. Those are universal screeners where we can glean diagnostic information, and they're part of our infrastructure that we're doing with all students, and then using that data to understand problems. Down to really, and again, we're looking at less time and money up here, more time and money to conduct things like commercially available assessments or tests. Sometimes we really might want to do a standardized measure of comprehension. If there's a disagreement, well, I think the student has a foundation skill problem that's just not reading accurately, and another teacher says, no, I think they're a word caller. Well, we might want to first see whether they're reading fluently and accurately. But then if they are, is there truly a comprehension problem? Do they, and sometimes we, or beyond word segmentation, we might want to learn some more about phonemic awareness. We know for younger students, phonemic awareness is huge when we're trying to understand learning deficits in reading. So some of these commercially available tests, maybe social emotional behavioral screeners or diagnostic assessments, might really be appropriate when we're trying to understand problems. But we would only use, I'm just going to bet, we would only use these more intense assessments that take time away from instruction, take the students out of instruction. We would only use those for a smaller segment of students. For many students, these universal screenings and informal assessments are adequate to really understand their learning needs. So kind of the drilling down approach that we like to talk about is, I'll talk about reading just as an example. If there's a comprehension problem, we might want to try and figure out, if they're fluent and accurate. We'll say they're fluent and accurate. Well, then probably we would want to look at, are they paying attention to the text? Are they motivated? Do they have good background information? Do they have good language skills? Those are kind of 4 areas that might impact comprehension. Do they need to be taught comprehension strategies? Usually, if you're fluent and accurate, you're paying attention, you're motivated, you have good language skills, and you're engaged in the text, you're going to have good comprehension. If they don't have good fluency and accuracy in the text, you might want to check out phonics and phonemic awareness. We drill down into skills. Then other factors we might want to consider: motivation, vocabulary, engagement with learning, social emotional behavioral issues, attendance, eyesight, hearing. Are they proficient in English? All these things, if we're looking at an individual problem-solving approach, these are essential to be ruling out if we were ever to get to a CSE referral. These are rule-outs for disability. Once we get to that more intense individual problem-solving process, we have to be considering all these factors. It's also, I really like to understand problems from an instructional hierarchy approach as well. If any of you are familiar with the instructional hierarchy, we just really briefly, there are all sorts of things in life that kind of fit into the instructional hierarchy. A lot of people use the driving example. When you're first learning how to drive, you're kind of clunky at it. You're inaccurate. Having taught a couple of kids how to drive myself, my own children, this instructional hierarchy became much clearer to me. But perhaps we talk about learning a piece of music. If any of you out there are musicians, when you first learn a piece, you're very disfluent, very inaccurate. You're not ready for prime time. You're just learning it. You're slow, inaccurate. As you play the piece over and over with some practice, you then become more fluent. So there are certain interventions that we would want to do if a student's just acquiring a skill. We need to build accuracy in specific skills. As that accuracy develops, we expand the skill set. These are interventions that map onto skill acquisition. We need guided, repeated practice when they're in the stage. Modeling. Those are interventions that address students that are in the acquisition stage of a skill. Many times, we have this curriculum mismatch where our curriculum demands generalization, where they kind of have the skill and they can demonstrate it in any setting, but they're still in skill acquisition. It's a curriculum mismatch. These are curriculum casualties where we expect generalization of skills when they're just in the acquisition phase. Once they're kind of at skill acquisition and they're more accurate at the skill, we need them to become more automatic. So we need them to become fluent at the skill and be able to execute those skills functionally. So we talk about mastery of those skills. And the interventions might be a little bit different for kids who are accurate but not yet automatic. So brief time trials to improve fluency, independent practice with materials. We want to get students but we want to make sure that where they're independent, they're at a very high level of accuracy so they're not practicing mistakes. Once they become very accurate and fluent, then we can promote generalization of those skills from one setting to another. But they might need explicit guidance on how to generalize. We might need to teach comprehension skills explicitly. How do you take a skill in one setting and apply it to another? Self-monitoring can be an important intervention at this step. But understanding the instructional hierarchy and knowing where a student is at a specific skill within that hierarchy can help us to guide interventions. Then we set goals, short-term goals, perhaps. By the next meeting in November, Zach will read 20 sounds correctly in 1 minute. That would be a short-term goal. You choose whether you want to set a 6-week goal or an 8-week goal, or maybe a longer-term goal that we're trying to set. Lily currently, and this I think could be a good RTI goal. It could be also an IEP goal that we could set. Lily currently reads 75 words correct in 6th grade text, which is below the 10th percentile. That's a present level of performance. In 35 weeks, she will read at least 120 words read correct with at least 95% accuracy. Her rate of improvement should be 1.3 words per week, 85th percentile. and she will be between the 10th and 25th percentile by the end of the intervention phase. This is a realistic but ambitious goal. Her rate of improvement would be 85th percentile. Even though she's still a bit weak by the end of the progress monitoring stage, we know that she's making a catch-up rate. And that is what we really are wanting to accomplish. We don't want to set a goal that's so high for a student that we could be really on track for a significant improvement but not recognize it. And again, we talked about setting these goals last week. So if you're new to, if this is the first webinar that you attended, I would highly recommend that you go back to last week's webinar on progress monitoring and setting realistic but ambitious goals. That will give some more information about setting goals within the RTI process. So these slides are available for you to review. I'm not going to read through each of these goals, but obviously there's some reading and math goals here. Actually, these are behavioral goals. So what problem-solving meetings are? So what we want to do in a problem-solving meeting is we get all our heads together and plan and coordinate. So having multiple perspectives on a problem can really help us to brainstorm and come up with some really creative ideas, not just about what the problem might be so that we identify it accurately, but also what are some brainstorming some ideas about resources available to address those problems. So it's a meeting of the minds, and having the different perspectives, sometimes having agreement, sometimes butting heads, and then resolving those issues can be really important. And so we really want to be able to have different perspectives in the meeting, because that's how we get creative. Being able to share the best information about the students, and having different people in the meeting that have different information about a student that helps us to kind of understand the whole student, that helps us to identify and address problems. Really having a process where we go through that problem identification, problem analysis, setting goals, establishing interventions, and then talking about how we're going to follow up with that. And really setting aside a significant chunk of time for a student. I think 30 to 40 minutes is a reasonable investment for students that are at risk for really chronic problems going forward. And then we really document a plan so that we have a common understanding of what we're going to do, documenting what we're doing, and then responding to the data, coming back to the table, trying something different. If that's not working, coming back to the table repeatedly until we really try to address that student, the student's problems. What they're not, and this is essential, that we've already gotten the student. Sometimes people will refer a student, I just want to get them on the radar screen. We've already got them on the radar screen with our post-benchmark meeting. We don't need to have a 30 to 40-minute meeting just to recognize that the student has a challenge. We already know they have a challenge from their benchmark meeting. That's not a productive use of time. It's not problem-solving meetings aren't a discussion about things that we can't fix. Certainly we understand that there are some difficulties that are a challenge, but we really focus on the movable targets. We can teach phonics, we can teach phonemic awareness, we can build fluency, we can teach comprehension strategies. There are lots of social, emotional, and behavioral skills that we can teach and motivate kids with. So there's lots that we can do during the 7 hours of the school day to improve student outcomes and support teachers. It doesn't really help us to discuss things that we can't fix or convince people that these are unfixable problems. It's also not a challenge for, okay, we're coming to the school principal or the teacher or the interventionist, and now it's your job. Here's the problem. Okay, now you go fix it. It's a team approach, and we're all in it to provide support for the student. So there's no one person that's going to be the fix-it person. The solution has to be integrated for the student. There's also, many times I think teachers feel that they're in the hot seat a bit, but this is in no way a place to blame teachers, support staff, or administrators, or certainly parents or the student for the problem. It's really talking about what we can do to support the student. I think in the bad old days, sometimes, and as a school psychologist, sometimes we inadvertently provide information to convince, oh, this student has this problem that's an intractable neurological problem. And sometimes we convince people, we disempower people from trying to address those problems. We don't really want to talk about these intrinsic, intractable within student problems that we can't address at these problem-solving meetings. We don't want to admire the problem. Getting the student on the radar screen isn't really helpful. We've already done that at our post-benchmark meetings. We used to kind of be at our, if we're not effective in our problem-solving meetings, sometimes we're here. I think really, if we're doing effective problem-solving, will we completely solve the problem? I don't know. Sometimes we get here, but at least we're going to take some positive steps towards improving student outcomes for students, and that's going to be good for teachers as well. So in your schools, again, we're kind of getting toward the end. We're a little bit limited for time. We got about 5 more minutes, so I hope you stay with me. But how many of you really go through, when you're going through that the problem-solving process, you go through all of those steps: problem identification, problem analysis, intervention planning, evaluating the intervention, and planning those the follow-through. Some steps or few or none of the steps. Thank you for those of you who are participating with this. I see some steps, but maybe perhaps not everybody is going through all those steps. I have to say, again, through those steps that I learned in grad school about 27 years ago, they haven't gone away from the literature on problem solving. Those steps are really important to problem solving. Okay, thank you everybody who participated. Thanks, Molly. What are some keys of effective, so when would we refer students? When educators, when we see that it's a really complex problem. Again, we're not going to address it through a triage meeting at the post-benchmark meeting. When we have students who are not responding to the tier 2 or 3 interventions, that we really need to take a closer look and really individualize and target the interventions. That might take more than the post-benchmark meeting. We really have to consider all aspects of the child. Whenever we're looking at a student suspected of having a disability, we should be looking at individual problem solving first, so that we make sure that we've done our due diligence to put everything in place that we can to address that student's needs. And I showed on that slide before, if we haven't ruled out some of those other factors, we get to do a CSE evaluation and the rule outs are in place. Well, these things could have been a primary problem. We haven't ruled out instruction as being an issue. We haven't ruled out student engagement as being an issue. So then we've done an evaluation and the student, we haven't done our due diligence. So anytime a student is suspected of having a disability, we should be doing some individual problem solving before the referral even takes place. Characteristics of a problem-solving meeting. We want team roles defined. You need a recorder, somebody that's leading the meeting. Again, you have the stages of problem-solving. It's kind of a structured approach, but you kind of go back and forth. Sometimes you kind of begin planning the intervention, but then you realize, well, maybe we haven't fully identified the problem. So you might go back. And this is key. People need to feel safe in the meetings, not blamed. There's a collegial, comfortable atmosphere, professionalism, and respect, not only within the members of the problem-solving team, but professionalism and respect towards parents and students as well. That is key to problem-solving. Focus on what can happen to help the student, not what's wrong with the student. We focus on things that we have control over. And we're really setting realistic goals so that we all have a sense of, if they achieve this, we'll know that we're on the right steps to addressing the student difficulties. Having that, I know I've talked about this many, many times, but a menu of evidence-based resources that are going to target academic or social emotional issues are there at the meeting so that we know what's going to have a high likelihood of follow-through. If we're just guessing at what's available, a high chance that it won't happen. Staff have training and resources to follow through. It's great when we have reading coaches or interventionists that can work with classroom teachers, and there's sort of a team approach. And a person might have a certain skill in an intervention, and they model that and help teachers with the follow-through for that. That the interventions are monitored and closely supported for students. These are some, when schools have that kind of infrastructure, it's a very, very positive approach. I like visual display of data. Sometimes a lot of text in terms of data isn't really helpful. Progress monitoring data for social, emotional, or academic issues really helps us to understand things a little bit better. Follow-up meetings for teachers to make sure that things have been followed through. Again, hopefully we're preventing CSE referrals because students are making honest, true improvements. But that follow-up for the intervention is kind of high stakes. We want to make sure that those interventions were followed through with. Students don't need to have disabilities to get intensive, targeted, and timely intervention. I think that is really the beauty of RTI. In the bad old days, we had to wait until there was a severe discrepancy before students got help. With a true RTI problem-solving process, students can get help right away, and they can get intensive, meaningful help right away. As soon as the teacher requests the meeting, we get that student right in. Just really quickly, this is what we're going to talk about a little bit more next week. I call them multidisciplinary team meetings, but it's where we're really doing our CSE process, and it is individual problem solving, but we're, the frequency would be as needed when we have CSE kind of business to take care of. We like to have the principal there, special education director sometimes, special education staff, reading staff, nurse if necessary, school psychologist, people that are really relevant to the referral or the annual review process or the reevaluation review process. And we're really talking about managing formal services to students. And these are individual problem-solving meetings, but we're going to really discuss this more next week at next week's webinar, so I hope that you show up. And again, some of the tasks that we would do at these meetings would be CSE decision makings, initial referrals, reevaluation reviews, annual reviews. All of this is individual problem solving. Using an RTI checklist, so if we've done our due diligence with individual problem solving, benchmark assessments, progress monitoring, responding to the data, our RTI checklist will be completed and we'll have a full understanding of the student going forward. Our RTI data can be used for setting IEP goals. We'll talk about this a little bit next week. So please join us next week for that. And just in this slide is just an example of what might be an IEP goal based on some RTI data. I'm not going to dwell on that as we're kind of nearing the end of our webinar. And there we've got a reading goal and a potential math goal if you wanted to kind of review over those. So the idea of, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. I don't know, that seems like kind of saying that we created the problems. We don't always create the problems. But sometimes if we need to do something differently than we're doing, or the problem isn't going away. I actually kind of looked this quote up because I think everybody thinks that Einstein said this, but the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. This has kind of been discussed as one of those myths that Einstein said it. I think they say, if it was really wise, Einstein must have said it at some point. But the idea of effective individual problem solving is taking a different look at the problem and trying something new. We can't just kind of do business as usual and expect a different result for students. So that concludes this webinar. I want to thank you for attending. My email is down here, and we really do appreciate your input on the polls, on the feedback form that Molly is going to provide to you at the end of this webinar. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that you can attend next week's webinar on more school and district problem solving.
And thank you so much, Seth, for another wonderful webinar. I see somebody typing, so we'll see if there's any questions. I did post the link to the evaluation, so if folks can take a few minutes to complete that, we appreciate that.
And obviously, I'm here as long as you want for any questions that you want to post through the chat. I'd be more than happy to stay and address any questions that you have.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone typing. So I think
I guess
we'll
I
wrap
answered
it.
all the questions.
Yeah, so you answered all the questions, which is wonderful. If you can just hang on for a minute. I do see Joanna typing. But we will be back next week, and of course, if there's questions, we can always take care of those next week. Very, very thorough. So great. Thank you so much for that feedback. And we hope everybody has a wonderful night, and we hope to see you back for the last one next Tuesday.